You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, whether it's the Terminator or the Governator, a world filled with autonomous armies laying waste to LA is not a great thought. You know, companies have even named themselves Skynet in honour of that homicidal AI. But what really is the deal with autonomy and war? And where are we going? G'day listeners, welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, Mick, and I'm here today to talk about autonomy and war. That's right, short intro today to keep that person with a nasty review happy, because I gave him a long intro in the last one. But my guest today knows all about autonomy and war. In fact, he did a bit of policy writing on it and has just released a book. And if you operate in the same Twitter sphere as I do, you're probably very familiar with his work. My guest is, of course, Paul Scharre. He is a senior fellow and director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He is author of the forthcoming book, Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War, and that was published in April 2018. That was last month. He has worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD for those in the know, in establishing policies on unmanned and autonomous systems, as well as emerging weapons technologies. He also led DoD efforts as Department of Defense in the US to establish policies on intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance programs, and directed energy technologies. He was also involved in the drafting of policy guidance in the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review and Secretary-level planning guidance. His most recent position was Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Paul has served as a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team Leader in the Army's 3rd Ranger Battalion, completed multiple tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. He's published widely and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, and the BBC. He has also appeared on nearly every podcast that's worth listening to as well. So that's a good thing. He's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he holds an MA in Political Economy and Public Policy. And he has a BS, and that's not the BS you're thinking of, people, in physics. Both are from Washington University in St. Louis. Paul, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. I understand it's quite an honour to be on the show, but you made some time for me, so I'll make some time for you.
Thank you.
Paul, before we delve into the world of future war and the rise of Terminator swarms, can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you found yourself going from battlefield commander to policy aficionado?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. You know, when I left the Army, I had the observation, fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, that there were people in Washington making decisions that affected the lives of young men and women, and those decisions did not always make a lot of sense to me. It was a little bit of head-scratching. You know, the first time I went to Afghanistan in 2002, right after the U.S. and allies took the country, I was like, okay, I can understand what we're doing here, right? We're pushing the Taliban out. We're trying to secure the country, rebuild it. And then we kept going back. And after a while, I was like, what are we doing here, really? So when I left, I wanted to do my part, to go to Washington and maybe make decisions that were less bad than we've been making. Got a master's degree and took a job in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the policy shop there, and worked there for a number of years working on defense investments, emerging technologies. I think some of the most rewarding experiences I had were working there under Secretary Gates, working on more ISR, more drones, pushing them to theater, and sort of trying to move the bureaucracy to do more for the warfighter, which is always a struggle. Unfortunately, shouldn't be, but tends to be. But really valuable and worthwhile experiences there.
Wow. So literally you marched off the plains of Afghanistan to go tell them in the swamp how to do things better. That's excellent. I said it, you didn't, so you should be safe. Now, my first question relates to your recent book. One I'm about halfway through at the moment. And for evidence, listeners, that's me tapping it there. It's quite a hefty tome. I actually bought the only copy in Sydney. Now, I know it's the only copy in Sydney because I went to every bookstore in Sydney looking for a copy. Please, no listener tell Corey Sharkey that I have bought Paul's book, because I haven't bought any of hers or read any of hers yet, and she's going to skin me alive. Now, in your book, Army of None, you talk about the increasing need or desire for autonomous platforms. Can you briefly explain to our listeners what autonomous military platforms are?
Yeah, well, we've seen a whole variety of uninhabited or unmanned platforms deployed around the globe. There are at least 90 countries and many non-state groups that have drones of some kind today. We've seen not just in the air, but also ground robots in the hands of a variety of countries, including non-state groups. Shiite rebel groups in Iraq have used armed ground robots and have posted pictures of them on social media. And we're seeing armed drones in many hands as well. At least 16 countries by our count. That number's going up. We may have some listeners who come back and say, well, I'm getting a higher number, and that may be true. It goes up continuously. There's quite a bit of proliferation coming from China. And then, of course, armed drones in the hands of non-state groups as well. The Islamic State and Syrian rebel groups have been using them in the Middle East. And with each generation, these robotic systems are becoming more autonomous. I would compare them to what we're seeing with automobiles, where each generation of cars has more autonomous features, things like intelligent cruise control, automatic lane keeping, automatic parking, automatic braking, all of these kind of features coming on board. And similarly, there's a strong desire among militaries to have more autonomy in these robotic systems. Anyone who's worked with teleoperated or remotely controlled systems knows that they can be very awkward, very brittle control mechanism. So more autonomy is very desirable from the perspective of making these things just sort of operationally valuable.
Well, interestingly enough, Uber have just announced they're going to develop a new rotor system for Uber cabs, which hopefully it's not too autonomous, because we struggle sometimes enough with the Uber drivers as it is. But I kid. They're much better than taxi drivers. Now, I also mentioned swarms earlier, and you talk about the idea of autonomous swarms in your book as a possible tactic to be employed in the air and at sea. I know this because it's early on in the book. What exactly are swarm tactics, and what can they teach us about autonomy or the use of autonomous platforms?
I think swarms are going to be a really significant trend in future combat. I'm actually surprised that there's not more excitement and research in this area and more innovation in tactics and doctrine. I think it's coming. Moving from a paradigm where we have one person remotely controlling a robotic vehicle to an autonomous vehicle that's performing a task on its own, that's valuable. But the real value is when we can expand the number of robotic vehicles under the control of one person. And that's where swarming comes into play. We don't really want a paradigm where, for each robot deployed in the battlefield, we have to have one operator behind that robot, tasking it, telling it where to go, even if it can drive or fly on its own. What you really want is that an operator is directing a swarm of vehicles and tasking that swarm. And that could be dozens or hundreds of vehicles that are working cooperatively together. Now, to make that happen, you have to have cooperative autonomy. You have to have teaming, where you task the group, the swarm, and the swarm conducts an action, and then the robots among themselves figure out how to do this. I open up the book in the first chapter with a demonstration that I went and witnessed by the Naval Postgraduate School out in California, where they were working on swarm versus swarm combat. Very exciting, very interesting stuff. They in the book, in that demonstration, they had a 10 versus 10 aerial swarm dogfight of these sort of relatively inexpensive styrofoam drones that they've built, so they could do them cheaply, they can scale them up, and then really invest in the algorithms, which is what is really going to matter for something like swarm combat. Is how do these drones communicate? How do they work together? It's a really fascinating area. They're working up to 50 versus 50 aerial swarm dogfight. And I think it's a place that we're going to see a lot more innovation in the coming years.
It's quite interesting. I've got a follow-up question on that I didn't send you in the run sheet, which is good because it keeps you on your toes. But But obviously with a swarm engagement, especially swarm against swarm, that's going to happen too fast for a human to process engagement orders, right? So, at the moment, we know that a human is in charge of weapons release. What happens with a swarm, or what happens with autonomous weapons if these engagements are too fast for us to understand and process?
Well, that's one of the tricky questions, right? Is as we put more automation on the battlefield, and there is this advantage in speed in taking humans out of the loop. Well, what is the role for humans? I would say that I could envision swarm warfare where humans are still in the loop, but it would look different. So what would be more like a human saying, there's an enemy swarm, and telling your friendly swarm to go attack it. Obviously, you couldn't have sort of swarm versus swarm combat, and humans are piloting each vehicle, or every time that your robot wants to fight, and launch a missile or a bullet, a human has to okay it. That's not going to be practical. But you can imagine a situation where the human says, the human's not going to be pushing the button on every single element of the enemy swarm. But the human says, this is a swarm, it's right here, and task yours to fight the entire group at once. And that still, I think, actually keeps quite a bit of human control. That's actually not that different than, for example, how a centrifuge weapon would work today, or a salvo of brimstone missiles launched at a group of tanks, or a group of small boats. And that's one of the things I sort of look at in the book is how is autonomy already used in weapons? And there are some examples of this where we have, we don't call them swarming, but you might want to think of them that way. We have groups of weapons that are launched at a sort of a group of targets, and then the weapons themselves sort of figure out which target to attack.
Yeah, that's I think most listeners could probably understand that sort of concept. IR profiling has been around for a while, so I guess listeners get into the book and try and understand it more. Actually, had a good read about some of the naval weapons, like the missiles, cruise missiles, and that seems fascinating. I was surprised about how long we've actually had that technology.
Yeah, it's amazing looking back at the history of this. When you sort of think about the essence of an autonomous weapon, a weapon that would go over a wide area and hunt for targets all by itself and then attack them without asking for any further permission. I think there's a common assumption that, well, these are out in the future. And by and large, I would say that's correct. Most homing missiles or missiles today are not autonomous in that sense. They're autonomous in the sense of many of them are fire and forget. Once you let them go, they're not coming back. They have a seeker on them. But the human is still choosing the target. If a torpedo is launched at an enemy submarine, the human is choosing, to launch it at that submarine, or to launch an air-to-air missile out at an enemy aircraft. But there are some exceptions to that. The Israeli Harpy is an exception today. And going back historically, the U.S. Navy had a missile in its inventory in the 80s called the Tomahawk anti-ship missile, the TASM, which basically did this. It was intended to be launched over the horizon to hunt for Soviet ships. And it could fly a search pattern and look for the ships and then take it out all on its own. So it was taken out of inventory in the 90s. And I think it's an interesting example of some of the challenges with autonomous weapons, in that in talking to naval officers familiar with it, who were interviewed in the book, one of the things they talked about was, well, if I have this missile on my ship and it can go over the horizon and it can look for Soviet ships, if I don't know where the enemy ships are, why am I launching the missile? Right? What's motivating me to do so? And missiles they're scarce, they're expensive. I only have so many of them on a ship. So, what's kind of the use case for that? And so it points to this idea that when you think about missiles or any kind of non-recoverable munition, you want to have some reasonable sense that the enemy is going to be there before you launch it. You want to have some kind of targeting.
Yeah.
But I think that calculation really changes with drones. And you could envision a situation where you might launch a recoverable robotic vehicle to go out on patrol. And if it could do the whole targeting and engagement cycle all by itself, it can look for targets and take them out. You might use that in a very different kind of way. And so I think we might see more use going forward as we see more recoverable robotic vehicles.
And I guess that's a cost saving there, which sort of brings me to my next question. we talked about how this is a little futuristic, and we also talked about how it's actually been happening for a while. So, for those of us not involved in tech research, we're having the eureka moment, maybe 20 years late. But there's a lot of money being invested in autonomous weapons. So what are some of the challenges in autonomous weapon development? And if there was a race, let's call it an autonomous arms race, who would be leading?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is most of the real path-breaking innovation in this space is happening out in the commercial sector. Now, it's not commercial companies that are developing autonomous weapons per se, but they're developing the underlying technology that will make them possible. So all of the same things that Google and Uber and others are developing for self-driving cars, for example, or that AI companies are developing in object classification, all would be very valuable for building a weapon that can navigate through the environment, identify targets, make a decision, and then attack them all by itself. It's very dual-use technology. And so in some ways, militaries are just importing this technology from the commercial space and then finding ways to apply it. I would hesitate to say I don't think that we're in the middle of an arms race on autonomous weapons. I don't see any country saying, definitively we're going to build them. All of the major powers are saying they're heavily into AI and autonomy and robotics, but you see different languages from these countries about this idea of crossing the line to lethal weapons. Some are more hesitant. Certainly, we see from Western democratic countries a lot more hesitancy about this, a lot more guarded language. Not the same from, for example, Russia and China. But I would characterize it as maybe we're at the starting blocks of an arms race. And I think the key, deciding factor here is probably not who has access to the underlying technology because it is so diffuse, but really what are countries willing to do with it. And when it comes to people willing to push the boundaries of using armed robots, I think the Russians come out way ahead of everyone else. They are building a fleet of armed ground robots for war on the plains of Europe. Just recently, this past week, there were reports that they have deployed the Uran 9 ground robotic system to Syria, and it's armed with a heavy machine gun and rockets. And so, if that's true, and it seems like it likely is, then that's a really significant development in thinking about ground robots in warfare. And Russia's been willing to, I think, really push the boundaries with weaponizing them in a way that we haven't seen as much with other countries.
That's pretty scary, actually. It kind of seems to me,
it's a little bit, right?
It's like a recipe for the Matrix, or at least T2 Judgment Day. I swear some of these designs come directly from James Cameron himself. So what I want to know, what I'd kind of like, is are there some sort of international laws, norms, customary law, treaties that exist to govern sort of autonomous weapon development?
Well, there's the laws of war, international humanitarian law, and they apply to autonomous weapons just like any other weapon. And so, to be used lawfully, these weapons would have to be able to comply with the principles of distinguishing between military and civilian targets, not targeting civilians intentionally.
Yeah.
They'd have to be able to comply with principles of proportionality, making sure that any collateral damage is not disproportionate to the military necessity of attacking a target. And other law of war principles like order to combat, recognizing surrender, for example.
Yeah.
These, in some settings, I think these would be quite challenging. I think these would be very challenging, for example, in building an autonomous weapon that could hunt its own targets in a dense urban environment where civilians are present, particularly if it was targeting people. Distinction is very difficult because, of course, people aren't necessarily wearing uniforms these days. I think applying with the principles of order to combat, not targeting people who have surrendered or incapacitated, is also probably pretty tricky for anti-personnel weapons, for anti-personnel autonomous weapons, that is. But there are other settings where it's totally doable today in a manner that complies with the laws of war. If, for example, you wanted to target enemy submarines underwater, if it's a big metal object underwater, it's a military submarine. It's not a hospital. It's not a school bus. It's a military submarine. Now, it might be your submarine, and that's a problem. Fratricide's a big issue, but that's not a legal concern. That's sort of a practical one, or one of operational risk. There's no rules that per se prohibit autonomous weapons. Now that's up for debate. There are, of course, groups that are campaigning, arguing that there should be a treaty banning them. But it's fairly clear to everyone who's looked at this that there are no sort of intrinsic legal obstacles today.
So I guess the good news is that if they follow international humanitarian law and the laws of war, it's kind of good for you if you're a civilian, but if you're a soldier, you might just die a hell of a lot quicker on the battlefield these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're likely to see with robotics and autonomy in general. I actually think the most near-term developments that we'll see in the Western world is the proliferation of precision-guided weapons to adversaries. That will, these types of, many of these innovations will make war much more violent and bloody than it has been in the past. And I think we will have to rethink, for example, infantry tactics.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're seeing, this is shifting slightly off the topic of autonomous weapons, but one of the things that we're seeing in ground combat is the proliferation of precision-guided weapons now down to the hands of the average infantryman. Yeah. As we see more miniaturized electronics. And so there's a variety of different things that start to hint at early versions of this, things like the Tracking Point Smart Rifle, DARPA's Exacto program that has a laser-guided 50 caliber bullet, the Pike missile from Raytheon, it's basically a laser-guided missile that you put in the hands of the infantry soldier. Small anti-personnel, kamikaze UAVs. So there's a lot of things that are really pretty remarkable. The counter-defilade weapons like the XM25 Punisher, things that begin to change the paradigm for infantry combat in a way that I think we haven't seen since the invention of the machine gun. And our tactics are going to have to change. Or if we don't, it's going to look like, what we saw in World War I, where people didn't adapt tactics to that revolution in ground combat. And the result was terrible.
And now that we've done a segue, it's a good way to sort of close it out because well, really, I'm just trying to wrap my head around all this technology. I did like, though, in the book how you relayed the story of the Gatling gun and how that was a technology that was designed by the originator to make war kind of less bloody because he thought it would reduce the numbers of soldiers required on the battlefield. But it kind of went the other way.
Yeah, so in writing the book, I wanted to tell the history. Well, first I wanted to really convey to readers how is autonomy already used in weapons. I think that a lot of military professionals, particularly in air and naval warfare that are more technical, really understand the fact that a lot of the weapons we have today have a lot of autonomy in them. An air-to-air missile is a lot of autonomy. A torpedo is a lot of autonomy. I don't hear that as much from non-military folks that work in this space. For example, people in the human rights community that are interested in banning autonomous weapons. So one of the things I wanted to do is make sure that people really understood how does this work today. And so I wanted to tell the history of the growth of automation in weapons. I thought initially you'd have to start a couple decades back, maybe in the 1970s with new digital technologies and networking. I realized that actually the first precision-guided weapons came out in World War II, so they were much earlier. They were around for 70 years. But then looking back even further, I realized that the story of automation really begins in the American Civil War with the invention of the Gatling gun as one of the first tools of warfare that applies mechanization, the technology coming out of the Industrial Revolution, to automate elements of firing. And in doing so, enables this reduction in human labor in the firing process and accelerates the explosive potential that one person can bring to bear on the battlefield. And the story, when I stumbled across this, it was just like finding, pure gold. It was great doing research on the book. There's this wonderful book about Richard Gatling and his weapon. I believe it's Mr. Gatling's Terrible Marvel. I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think it's the title. And the author tells the story about how Gatling was motivated to build this weapon by looking all of these wounded soldiers returning from the American Civil War. And, he'd been an inventor. He'd invented some agricultural implements. And he thought to himself, there's got to be some way to use modern technology to reduce bloodshed in warfare. So he comes up with this idea that what if we could reduce the number of soldiers on the battlefield? Wouldn't that save lives? Then there'd be fewer soldiers out there fighting. And so he has this idea of automating the firing process and creates the Gatling gun. I think most people probably have this image of it in their head, sort of this, what we think of today as kind of a chain gun with 6 barrels in a circle, motivated by a hand crank at the time. So now we have things where they're just fully automatic. At the time, you had to hand crank it. And it automates the process, though, of loading the bullets and then firing them. So you have the belt of ammunition, and then you just crank it, and then it's spewing out lead. And it basically allowed 4 people who were operating it to deliver the same firepower as 100. This huge explosion in the amount of firepower delivered on the battlefield. And so, hey, Gatling wins. Well, of course, we now know, looking at history, that the Gatling gun, a forerunner of the machine gun, was far from making it more humane and less violent. In fact, it was quite the opposite. That it dramatically increased the violence on the battlefield and the bloodshed that we saw in World War I, when this technology finally matured in the form of machine guns and was used heavily on both sides by European powers. And that's, I think, just a really interesting cautionary tale. Thinking about new technologies, and some of their ill effects.
Yeah, it's a brilliant lesson for current weapons developers when doing their sales pitches. Perhaps don't think you're going to end conflict once and for all. You might just be exacerbating it. Now, Paul, we are coming close to time. Some of my listeners are getting tired legs on the treadmill, and other ones are screaming at the other drivers on the beltway at the moment. So I have my final question, and that's one that all guests get on the show, and it relates to our mission on the show of defining wars in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, did to continue this very, very important debate on war. I ask each guest to finish the sentence "war is." So, Paul, I ask you to finish the sentence "war is."
War is terrible. War is bloody. War is exciting. War is dangerous. War's, here's the dirty truth that people don't like to talk about. Sometimes combat's fun. So, yeah, war's a lot of things.
And that, listeners, is nearly every definition we've ever had on the show wrapped up in one nice neat package. That last bit is one that we've had a little bit more admittance of this past few episodes, of some people talking about how war can be a place where people actually feel like they are enjoying it, or they feel like they belong. So it's interesting, listeners. That's why we need to keep defining this sentence, because one, it's the hook I've got for the show, so it's staying, and also it helps us think of a lot of different perspectives. And Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show and providing us with your perspective on autonomous weapons.
Thank you so much.
Now, listeners, thanks very much for tuning in, buying books through the Book Depository link. And speaking of books, just in case you missed it, Paul has a book out, Army of None, and you can grab Paul's book through the show notes on the website, in the episode show notes, on your iTunes, wherever you listen to good podcasts and have a description of this episode. They'll take you to Book Depository. They have free global shipping, so that can reach you anywhere on the globe. That also includes Australia. And we also get a tiny kickback from any book sold through our links. Also, check out Paul's research on cnas.org. He's got a lot on there because, well, that's his job, to write papers and do really cool research. You will learn a lot. I've been following it for quite some time, and that's why I got so excited about the book. And, of course, the other place where you need to support Paul will be Twitter. Follow him at Paul_NBSP. I'm going to spell your last name, Paul, because it's quite difficult for Australian listeners who generally only go with one syllable. Scharre. And you can probably see that in the show notes anyway, listeners. And until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.